Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Hewitt Shaw, the President of the City Club's Board of Directors, and I'm pleased to welcome to today's Friday Forum Sandy Cutler, the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Cleveland-based Eaton Corporation. We are fortunate to have Sandy join us today to discuss the initiatives of the Campaign to Fix the Debt, a national, nonpartisan organization dedicated to putting America on a sounder fiscal and economic path, focusing on the importance of our elected officials implementing a comprehensive plan to address the long-term drivers of our ballooning national debt as impacted by our budget deficits. The co-founders of the campaign are former Senator Alan Simpson and former White House Chief of Staff Erskine Bowles, who served as co-chairs as the National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform, leading to the now famous Simpson-Bowles Deficit Reduction Plan, which, despite its broad bipartisan support, has yet to find its way into national legislation. Sandy serves on the CEO Fiscal Leadership Council of the Fix the Debt campaign, along with many others such as Steve Ballmer of Microsoft, Jamie Dimon of J.P. Morgan, and recent City Club Speaker Bob Moritz of PwC. Over the past year or so, we've had a number of governmental officials at our forum addressing our national fiscal issues, including recently Treasury Secretary Jack Lew and former Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi. But today, we will hear from a senior executive of a large Cleveland multinational industrial company with frontline appreciation for how those companies employ the people in our communities, provide the goods and services that all make our lives better, and otherwise bring value to our society. Importantly, though, in addition to his role as a CEO of a private company, Sandy serves on a number of community, philanthropic, and quasi-governmental boards, so he also understands and can speak to the impacts of federal fiscal policy, not just on the business community, but on the broader social fabric that affects our communities. So with that introduction, I am delighted to introduce to you today Sandy Cutler.
Well, thank you, Hewitt, and thank you, everyone, for being here today. It's been a couple of years since I've had a chance to speak in this forum, and I appreciate the earlier introduction and guarantee that this would be a civil exchange. So we'll try to start on that basis. As I said, it's a pleasure to be back here. Last time I was here, I really had the opportunity to share some thoughts about national competitiveness with you, and that issue remains front and center as we talk about the impact of the debt and the impact it's having upon the so many things we've come to expect in our country that are being pushed off the table because the debt is becoming a bigger and bigger number every year. When you think about competitiveness, nothing is more fundamental than competitiveness than fiscal prudence. Monetary policy by itself can't help a country unless you have a good model of fiscal prudence. And I and many others would argue that we've lost that discipline in this country, and it is leading us to a situation where our fundamental competitiveness, our ability to create jobs, our ability to ensure growth, and to get back to the type of trend growth that we've seen in this country since World War II has been fundamentally compromised. Many people ask, why is growth so important? Without growth, we don't have jobs. Without jobs, we don't have wealth and income for families. We don't have the ability to put our children through school. We don't have the ability to do the infrastructure we need in our individual communities. So this is not a subject of just academics that speak about economic growth rates and economic theory. This is fundamental to the health of our country. For many of us who've been around some time, we know that the debt problems, when people talked about sovereign debt was a problem of the emerging nations of the world, typically taking on a lot of debt to try to finance early growth. That is not the situation today. The emerging nations of the world do not have a debt problem. In fact, the debt problem of the world is now in the developed nations of the world, and it sits squarely in Europe, the US, and Japan. And it's no coincidence that if you look at the growth rates in those regions of the world, those are the growth rates that are mired under 2% GDP for 3 years in a row, with no prospect of improving at this point. If that's not sobering enough, I ask you to think about just a couple other parallels for countries that we sometimes read and think could not possibly be the same as the U.S., but I would argue they are the fundamental predictors of what will happen in the U.S. if we don't fix the debt. Let's just think about Greece for a moment. While it seems like it's a small country and it's a continent away, the situation that we've seen develop in Greece in terms of when their debt hit 113% of GDP, which frankly is where the U.S. will hit this year, has been pretty dire. Not only have the impacts for citizens been awful there, the impact for foreign direct investment has been awful there, and the contagion that spread out of Greece over to other countries, as you think about what's happened in Portugal, Spain, France, and Italy, has been severe. We now look at a continent with a growth rate this year of negative GDP for one of the first times when there hasn't been a major conflict going on in that continent. So while we often look at these other countries and think, gee, that couldn't happen here, I would argue that the State of the Union in the U.S. sits in similar peril. The time to act is now. The time to act is as a bipartisan group making a difference in the future of the economic security of this country. And we can't kick it down the road any longer. As we think about our national reputation for fiscal prudence, I have the opportunity in my job as head of a multinational company to travel around the world. And in the 38 years I've been in business and had the opportunity to travel around the world, our reputation for fiscal prudence has never been worse. I think it's reflected in terms of how people think about holding the securities of our country. It's reflected in terms of how they think about investing in this country. But all of this is fixable if we will come together as a country with a commitment to a bipartisan solution to fixing the debt, and do it now, not 5 or 6 years from now, not 10 years from now, because in only 3 years, debt as a percent of GDP could be as high as 175%. And those are disastrous numbers for any country. The issue that's so tough about this problem is that it's going to hurt in the short term. And when you think about any step that you take, either in increasing taxes or cutting back on benefits that come from the government or investments they make, it's going to touch almost every American, just as the spending of the money over the last 25 years has. And so this medicine is going to be tough medicine. And I think everyone's got to be willing to step up and say that we're going to make the difference here in the short term to try to build a stronger country for our future and ensure that we get back to the kind of economic growth rates that we've been fortunate to see, typically a full point stronger than Europe has seen through any economic cycle. But just to set the state in terms of how difficult this fight's going to be, I'd ask you just to think in this room. Think about these questions. We want to make a difference to do 3 things, first of all. First, to restore the promise of attractive growth. Second, for increased investment. And third, increased job opportunities. But the cost of getting there, as I mentioned, is going to be difficult emotionally. And let me just take you through a series of questions I think is exactly why Republicans, Democrats, and Independents have had difficulty in building a consensus. Who in this room wants to see your tax rates go up further? Who in this room wants to lose your deductions? Who in this room wants to see a spending cut on education? Who in this room wants to see programs that address poverty cut back? Who in this room wants to see Social Security benefits cease? Who in this room wants to see Medicare benefits cut? That's exactly the problem. These are all colliding priorities, each one of which has their own defender, and around every one of these questions is a group of people who will not compromise in any way. And I and other people involved with Fix the Debt would say, if you aren't willing to step to the middle of the table and make compromises in every one of these, we can't solve this national problem. This is where the campaign to fix the debt comes in. This is a nonpartisan movement of people from all across the economy and government, private citizens, major CEOs, members of the government who are coming together to say this is the time to make a difference. To push this further down the can condemns our country and the next generation of people to a country that's not going to be very interesting economically. We're not going to be able to create the jobs, the wealth, the investment, the infrastructure, the educational programs, and provide benefits to those who aren't as fortunate unless we fix this problem now. You've heard a little bit about the campaign to fix the debt, founded by Alan Simpson and Erskine-Bowles, co-chaired by Judd Gregg, Ed Rendell, and Michael Bloomberg. But the group's much bigger than that. We've now got over 338,000 members of this organization. It's been underway for a couple years, and the excitement for those who are involved in it is really substantial. What I'm going to do at the end of this talk is ask you to consider joining. because it's about getting every American to join this movement. And nothing could be more fundamental in being an American than fixing the debt of this country. Now, the campaign recognizes that this isn't going to be easy work, and that we're not pushing any one plan in particular. We're pushing a number of principles because we recognize that if we write a plan, it's going to be our plan and not the plan that the Senate and the House will come around. The legislative bodies of our country have got to come around several principles that we want to go ahead and espouse, and I'll cover those with you. But that process is an important process of compromise that for us to get in the midst of it would be a big mistake. There are 4 key core principles to what we're trying to do. First, we must get all policymakers to acknowledge that the growing debt is a serious problem and you can't kick it down the can, or kick the can down the road. And we just think what's happened in the last 4 weeks. As the new CBO estimates came out as a result of some of the prepayment that came back from Freddie and Fannie, many people have said, well, my heavens, now the debt's going to be less this year. We don't need to deal with it. All it's done is postpone by a number of months the same crisis. And this is where we need some common sense. If there was a fire in your house and it was 2 rooms from you versus 1 room, would you decide it's not a problem? This fire is burning very loud, and we don't care very brightly, and we don't really care whether it's an issue that comes to fruition in August or whether the debt ceiling hits in November. It's here with us now. It's time to make a change. So don't push it down the road. Secondly, it's urgent that the plan has to be a plan that encompasses all the elements of both taxes, spending, and tax expenditures. Said another way, those loopholes in the tax system. The key here is that we've got to find a plan that hits both revenues and expenses. And it's not adequate for people involved in this debate to say the solution is all by increased revenues or all by cutting expenses. Both have to be in the game. Third, the program has to be enacted now. We need a plan that we can see, but then it has to be put into place gradually. We are in a very fragile economic recovery. People on both sides of the aisle understand that fact. Simply by committing to a plan that will get the debt down to acceptable levels by 2023 doesn't mean everything happens in 2 months. And the scare tactics that are espoused by both parties are totally non-constructive. We're looking for a long-term solution to a problem that has happened over 20 to 25 years. We need a plan laid out in 1 year that everyone agrees to, and then we'll work it into the economy as the economy can support it. Fourth, in order to develop a fiscal plan that really will be financially and politically acceptable, it has to be bipartisan, and it's got to include reforming Medicaid. It's got to include improving efficiency in overall health care plans. It's got to include limitations on future cost of health care in the country. It has to strengthen Social Security so that it's solvent and it'll be there for future beneficiaries. It's got to have pro-growth tax reform. It's got to broaden the base, it's got to lower rates, and it's got to get rid of some of the deductions that are available in the system today. Each of those budget stages are really challenging in their own right. Just as I mentioned them, you can probably feel different people in the room stiffen around these issues. However, if they're all not taken together, there is no chance for a political solution to a tough economic problem. This requires us all to step into this fight because it is America's fight. Now, the recommendations of the last several bipartisan agreements lay out a lot of good formats. The problem is not how to do this from an economic point of view. The problem is creating enough of a consensus in this country that this needs to be done now, and it needs to be done quickly. The plan has got to be really conducive to long-term growth as well, and that's what we come back to. You don't implement all this in the first year. We need job growth in this country. We're mired with over 7% unemployment rate. We need good jobs in this country, and we need this country to be capable of building sources of capital so we again can become the economic power this country has historically been. Now, the recently released update that many of you probably read from the Simpson-Bowles study, I think presents a really balanced and comprehensive approach for how to go about this process. If you haven't read it, I would commend it to you. There are a couple key points in terms of it. You recall that about $2.7 trillion of deficit reduction has been enacted through the several acts of our legislators over the last 2 years. We need a total of $5.2 trillion. That's the number we need to start to bend the cost curve. So when you hear individuals say we're all done at 2.7, we're about half done. And the tougher work lies ahead of us because the easier pieces have been picked off at this point. We need to set the cap for federal debt in the United States somewhere between 60 to 70%. That's been the design point for our economy since the 1950s. We're at 113 going to 175. If you don't want the United States to look like Greece and France and Spain, we really need to move now, because to bend this curve is going to take a number of years. If you read Simpson-Bowles, you'll see there are 5 key components to that plan. The first is to tighten and strengthen discretionary caps on spending. And that's all about efficiency, but it's doing it more intelligently than this meat axe called sequestration. We've already seen that a meat axe approach like that is not well thought through, as soon as we ran into the first glitch, which was around airports, quickly people backed up from it. That's not a long-term committed plan that is prepared to stay in place to deal with very difficult situations. Second, reform federal health spending. I talked a little bit about this before. Beneficiaries have to be thought of in this process. This isn't a situation where people can take a meat axe to our health care program or to our benefit programs to support senior citizens across this country. It's a thoughtful process, but if we don't do something about these, those benefits aren't going to be there in the future. Third, it deals with identifying additional spending cuts to reduce various government programs. And there are a lot of them, whether it's modernizing the military, prioritizing health and retirement programs, improving the financial state of the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, our Postal Service, which is a disaster currently, the Pell Grant program, which is a wonderful program by end intent, but not in terms of how it's financed. You go down this program, the lists are very long. There are specific recommendations in that plan in terms of what to do in each of these areas. And they're thoughtful in terms of how they've been put together. Fourth, enact comprehensive tax reform. It's got to start with eliminating a lot of the deductions. Our fundamental tax program in this country has not been refined since 1986. Since then, it has been band-aided and band-aided and band-aided, and most of those band-aids have caused leakage out of the system that has reduced revenues. We need to think about a pro-growth tax system. We need to adopt a territorial tax system to make companies competitive around the world. We need to broaden the rate, or broaden the base, and we need to reduce the rate. Those are the issues that you can get to with zero-sum tax reform, but pro-growth tax reform. Fifth, we've got to implement government-wide reforms to reduce waste, fraud, and abuse. There is no one-line item in any federal budget that's labeled abuse or reform, but this is an issue of getting in, just like people do in any organization, and trying to find those areas that over time unintentionally have built up in terms of uncompetitive cost. The federal government bureaucracy is big enough that we can find cost to get out of it. And I think as any other result of anybody who's been involved in any organization, when you pull up part of the flowers out of the garden, the next year it blooms better. That prospect is there for our government as well. Now, the plan calls for separate reforms, if you read Simpson-Bowles, in Social Security, and it's modeled off the 2 bipartisan commissions that already have come together for 2 past presidents, broadly endorsed and given those recommendations, never implemented. So we've left that alone and said just take the plans that have already been laid out and have been accepted by both parties. And also for the Transportation Fund, a fundamental issue for competitiveness in this country. And any of us who travel around this country and then have the opportunity to travel elsewhere, we've seen that our transportation system has really fallen into a state where we don't have the same kind of capabilities that many of the emerging nations around the world do today. Not only is this plan politically achievable, it would be one terrific economic opportunity for our country. Taken as a whole, we can replace the mindless sequestration approach. And if you read the Simpson-Bowles plan, you'll see that it removes about 70% of what was in the sequestration package and goes back with very specific, we think far more targeted and thoughtful programs. It'll increase the total deficit reduction program accomplished since 2010 to $5.2 trillion. And that'll mean by 2023, using a more conservative assumption around what the country's GDP will be, and that's key whenever you look at these numbers, that we might have a chance of getting down to 72%. Still not to 60, but to 72%. Think about that. 2023, if we take the action now, it's going to take that long to get to 70%. That's why we have to move now. will reduce the deficit by over $500 billion in 2023 compared to the $60 billion that's in the sequestration plan. So while many stand back and say just let sequestration work, frankly, it's not adequate. It will not get us to bend this curve. Putting that debt on a downward path, getting us back to 60 to 70% of the U.S. GDP, our debt, is really going to open up enormous opportunities once again for our country. But how do we make this happen? This is not an issue of trying to figure out the right economic plan. Many, many people far brighter than I have laid out really good plans for fixing the national debt. The problem is our country is so divided over each of those questions I asked you about. You want higher taxes, you want to lose deductions, you want to sacrifice Social Security, that people have lost the collective will to solve this problem. So we're leaving it on automatic, and it's piling up year after year after year. I don't think that's our responsibility as Americans. I think our responsibility as Americans is to do what this country has done every other time it's faced a challenge, and that's to stand up and take it on head on and solve the problem. Not to do so means it will be the first generation of Americans to allow our children to live in a country that doesn't have the prospects that we did. I think that's unconscionable. So how do we do this? The President has gone beyond his congressional Democratic colleagues and already dealing with some of the entitlement reforms. There are individual Republicans who have stood up and have said, we will stand up for tax increases. But we don't have everyone at the middle of the road here. And the only way that's going to happen is the same way it happens when you vote for your individual representatives, when you express your opinions on these subjects, when you're knowledgeable about the specifics to challenge your legislators, and you make your will known. And so what we're asking of you, and one more analogy if I could, because I've heard this a lot when I've been down in Washington talking to individual members of the House or the Senate, is people have compared this as jumping off a cliff and assuming that it'll be okay. I think there are a lot of examples where people haven't jumped off a cliff, they've jumped into an opportunity. And I'd ask you just to think about Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. They survived their jump, and I'm quite convinced that both Congress, both houses and the President, Republicans, Democrats, and Independents, and most importantly, citizens of the country, if we come together around this issue, we can jump off that cliff. We're going to be just fine on the other side. In fact, not to do so, I think, means we're sitting on a volcano. And that is not a very secure position. So when we think about what are we asking you to do, your legislators need to hear from you, and they need to hear from you now, and they need to hear from all of you at this point. So I'm asking that you really consider doing two things. One, join this coalition. Join Fix the Debt. Dial in, and we can give you all the materials today, and we'll give you the web page. Get the updates on the specific facts. Find an objective source of information about this issue, and become an informed citizen and express yourself. Secondly, I would ask you locally here to weigh right in with your legislators. I want you to call up each of your legislators, and I would ask you to contact them specifically, and in case you don't know who they are, I'd ask you to call Marcia Fudge, I'd ask you to call Marcy Kaptur, and I'd ask you to call Sherrod Brown, and tell them that you're willing to reform entitlement programs. I'd ask you to call Dave Joyce, I'd ask you to call Jim Renassi, I'd ask you to call Rob Portman, and tell them you'd support increasing taxes. It's the other side of these issues that we've got to get people to come together on. Individual legislators today are being unelected by their own parties, not by the other party. And that's an indication as how far apart our parties are around this issue. If there's one thing that this country should be united about, it's about getting our fiscal prudence back in place. Because without fiscal prudence, all the things everybody's holding out individually cannot be financed. So that to believe that we can continue our entitlement programs, we can continue our investments in education, we can continue our investment in infrastructure without a change really is not adult behavior. And so we're asking you to stand up as Americans, join this coalition called Fix the Debt, get the information, and express yourself. Now, Senator Voinovich, who's here today, is a co-chair here in the state with myself in terms of this effort. And we sent letters out to over 100 CEOs last year in terms of trying to get them in this game. We've had a great response. At Eaton last year, I sent notes out to 20,000 employees here in the U.S. asking them to send letters to Washington. And within a week, we had 5,000 letters down on legislators' tables. For all of you who are in organizations where you can mobilize your employees, That is a tremendous source of leverage in terms of carrying our message and carrying this need to make a difference. The time to act is now. The person who can act is you, and the power comes from all of us. So I thank you very much for your attention today. I look forward to your questions, but I would really ask you, don't leave this luncheon and think someone else can get this job done. This job gets done by individual Americans whose power together makes a difference in returning us to the economic status we ought to have in this country. And remember, we won't have that till 2023 if we start today. So let's not delay it a day. Thank you very much.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we are listening to a Friday forum featuring Sandy Cutler, Chairman and CEO of Eaton Corporation, and a member of the campaign to fix the debt and the CEO Fiscal Leadership Council of that campaign. We will return to our speaker momentarily for our traditional City Club questions. We encourage you to formulate your questions now and remind you to keep your questions brief and in the form of a question. We welcome all of you here today and those listening to WCPN 90.3 FM, WCLV, WTAM, or one of the many radio stations across the country. Our television broadcast partners are WVIZ, PBS Idea Stream. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. June 7, the City Club welcomes Steve Millard, President and Chief Executive Director of the Council for Smaller Enterprises. Alliances between the City Club and other organizations to bring speakers to our forum are a very important part of our organization and are very beneficial to those other organizations. An example of that is on June 14th, when the City Club will kick off this year's Business Leaders Series with Rex Tillerson, Chairman and CEO of ExxonMobil Corporation. For more information about our upcoming forums, please refer to our website, cityclub.org. If you wish to make reservations for upcoming programs or order a CD or DVD of today's program, you can call the City Club at the phone number listed on the website. We are pleased to welcome today guests at tables hosted by Baker Hostetler, Eaton Corporation, Fix the Debt, Kent State University, Key Bank, and Squire Sanders. Thank you for your support. Today's forum is the annual George Gunn Memorial Forum on the American Economy, made possible by a generous endowment gift from the George Gunn Foundation. Joining us today at the head table is Dave Abbott, Executive Director of the Gunn Foundation. Dave, would you please stand to be recognized? Thank you. Now we would like to return to our speaker for our question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphones today are Carrie Miller, our Program Director, and Associate Development Director, Mike Cromaldi. May we have the first question, please?
Mr. Cutler, I wonder what you think of the ideas of Paul Krugman, the Nobel-winning economist, columnist of the New York Times and Princeton University.
Well, he's written about 15 books, so for me to be precise, but more seriously, I think if you look at the issue of the interface, and he's written quite a bit on the interface of fiscal and monetary policy over time, and I personally think what has been going on from a monetary policy point of view here in the U.S. has made great sense over the last couple of years. What's been obviously rocking the markets for the last 2 days is the prospect of when you begin to unwind that. We think, and really the purpose of my talk today, is the issue for the U.S. is not so much about monetary policy, it's much more about fiscal policy. And the fact that we've gone 4 years without a budget at the federal level is perhaps the clearest indication that we've lost track that way. It's sort of inconceivable to think that any one of us in a family or a business or a charitable organization goes through a year without having a budget. And that lack of fiscal discipline is just a very fundamental issue that is having, as I mentioned before, we think disastrous potential impacts for our economy going forward. You're running a company that we do business in 175 different countries. We can see the difference that fiscal discipline makes from country to country, the difference it makes in foreign direct investment into those countries, how the securities of those companies or countries are valued, and what it means for jobs. And that's one of the reasons we're as concerned, and I join so many other CEOs being concerned about this lack of fiscal prudence here in our country.
Hello. You mentioned something in your speech that our political leaders or our legislators are elected by the political parties, not by the people. And I think that was spot on. And I think part of the problem is our gerrymandering of House districts, where you have very safe districts for congressional legislators who really are only focused on the interests of their party. So my question is to fix the debt, focusing it all on maybe reforming the political process so that we elect leaders who are who have an ease to maybe come to an agreement, as opposed to being in safe districts where they are only looking at one point of view.
Yeah, it's obviously gerrymandering in the country has taken place over a long time. We don't have time. And so our focus is on the economics, and our focus is building the consensus with Americans, regardless whether they're independents, whether they're Democrats, whether they're Republicans. We don't have 15 years to fix the gerrymandering system. We've got about 2 years to get at this debt issue. And that's really the education we're trying to get out to people, because when I talk to people across the country, so many people fractionate around the subject you just mentioned. They want to go spend their time on that. You can break your pick on that in 15 years, and you will not have solved the economic problem. We've got to solve the economic problem right now.
Well, we had another interstate bridge collapse. We had another interstate bridge collapse. The good news is nobody died. The bad news is I think we'll probably shrug it off. What is your solution in economic terms for rebuilding this country's infrastructure?
Well, you may remember, some of you who have been around government expenditure planning for some time, that when the original element was put in, the 25-cent tax was put in on gas, and this goes back quite some time ago, so the what is worth today is 11 cents, was put in for the funding of the highways here in this country, highways and infrastructure. There was quite a squawk when that was done. It served this country very well. We've not updated that on a purchase price parity basis in over 15 years. As a result, the money that flows into our infrastructure today is much less than it used to be. And then as an example of poor fiscal prudence, you may recall when the ethanol credit was put here in the U.S. that ethanol was not subject to that tax. Now, over a 5-year time period, that took almost $60 billion out of revenue for highways and structure. So very noble to get ethanol, but you gave something up at the same time. And those are some of the kind of decisions that we would highlight as not good fiscal prudence for the country. There's no question we've got an eroding infrastructure relative to the best in the world. You still, when you come back to the U.S. after being in some of the emerging nations I traveled to, you treasure what we have here. But it's not on a relative basis what it once was. So again, fixing the highway and transportation funds, not allowing those funds to flow into the general fund where they will end up being pulled off to other issues is a really key issue of competitiveness for the country.
Sort of piggybacking on what we were already asked about this transportation network, the gas tax did start at, at 25 cents a gallon, and the basis of that tax is clearly inappropriate anymore because lots of cars are using electricity and natural gas and all kinds of other things, so that's eroding from that perspective. Obviously, it's not keeping up with inflation, and the amount of gas that a car, the old 12-mile-a-gallon cars that we had 25 years ago are gone. You're buying cars now at 30 and 40 miles a gallon, so you're just getting less revenue. The suggestion has been made that we need to have a vehicle miles traveled tax, which makes a heck of a lot of sense, except it doesn't work a whole lot well in balancing the load on individuals unless it also includes a tonnage factor. So you charge 3 cents a vehicle mile and a penny for every half ton up that. What do you think of that kind of option as a much more practical way? And then you can get into privatizing the highways because there's enough revenue coming in that you can have. Our railroads are doing quite well, frankly, right now because they're funded through actual revenues and they have a competitive advantage in terms of efficiency.
Yeah, there have been a lot of proposals for how to deal with the transportation issue. Unfortunately, a number of the mechanisms you mentioned are very difficult to administer when you're dealing with people with personal vehicles. It's a different issue when a large displacement truck or a rail car has to come in for annual certification, and you can look at issues of mileage. And I would just say that while we're very pleased to participate in the electric car area as well as a company, those numbers aren't significant today. So I think the more convincing approach to this whole issue of both fuel economy and emissions is to really look at a displacement-based tax, which frankly is what the rest of the world does. It's only the U.S. that works under this theory of CAFE, which is a U.S.-created issue. Frankly, it creates big areas where you really don't have the competitiveness between the vehicles that are created elsewhere around the world in the U.S. You'd greatly simplify this situation if we just adopted what the rest of the world went to. Then off of that, they are using significantly higher taxes on their fuel sources. Many of you are aware in Europe that tax, instead of being 100% tax that goes into the federal coffers, is 300%. And that's partially how university health care is funded in Europe. So tax policy becomes a very important element of each of these areas, and you can't just take one piece. It's got to be the whole fabric when you think about what percentage of the country's GDP do you want to be in the federal government, what percentage of GDP do you want to come from collective revenues. And you need to start with some of those key principles, because that's what allows you then to think about what allowable level of annual deficit are you going to have, and then how large are you going to allow the deficit, or the accumulated deficit being the debt, to become. And unless you start up with those high numbers, if you start at the low programs every time, you never get to an agreement. And that's part of our problem, is everybody's got their one issue they feel strongly about. We got to get back to starting with a 60-70% cap, no more than 2 to 2.5% of federal deficit per year, and then you start to break these programs from the top down. No different than any one of us does. If you have $100 in your wallet, $100 is all you can spend. And you don't start by adding up all the things you want to spend it on and come up to 110 and say, I'm going to spend 110. And that's, on a simple basis, part of our problem in terms of our government programs today.
Thank you. President Obama, in a televised interview recently, said, we don't have an immediate crisis in terms of debt. And it kind of reiterated that same problem we saw right here when Jack Lew was in that very podium just a few weeks ago, and he was saying that we basically have it under control, and that's a long-term problem, not a right-now problem. What kind of success have you had in pressing, either in front of the curtain or behind the curtain, with the administration, that we at least have to deal with this, regardless of if it's taxes or spending, but just that it is a problem and not just something to be kicked down the road?
Well, and I think so much of this depends upon what you feel the appropriate economic model for the country is. If you look at the U.S. over long periods of time, those revenues have averaged about 18.5%. But if you look at European countries, you're going to find that those numbers are 10 and 15 points higher than that. So that if you feel the right model for the United States is to have the federal government revenues or expenses be up at that type of level, 35%, we don't have a problem. If you feel that the reason that you've had stronger economic growth in this region than other areas of the world has become, we have had balanced budgets, we've not gone long periods of time with deficits, and we've kept that balance between that 18 to 24% range, then we have a big problem. Now, I don't think you can stand and say we don't have a problem right now, because once you're up over 100% and you're going north and you have no way to bend the curve to get back down, I don't know how you come to the conclusion that's not a problem. I think the former is a little bit of a debate about how much should the model be built to be a higher spending central government. That's a debate, but we've got a debt problem right now. And I would submit to you, as a business person, I'm not particularly comfortable seeing our country move from this 18 to 24% range in terms of the size of the government as percent of GDP to one that's 35 to 40, because we don't see the growth in those countries that have that kind of central government.
Good afternoon. I've seen in so many budget processes where an expenditure cut is proposed or a rate change is proposed, people come out with pitchforks and waving signs, and the decision makers say, well, you know what, this is only going to help 1 or 2% of the problem. Why don't we throw it back in? How do you combat that? Because there's really nothing out there that by itself is going to be a silver bullet.
No, and you're right, and that's why I think the principles of the fix of the debt, and I would urge you all to read them. They aren't 500 pages long, so this won't take you forever to get through them. The principles is you have to have a comprehensive plan, and you need to do it at once, because you will get cherry-picked on individual issues. And there are very strong advocacy groups who have very strong convictions around every one of these elements that are represented in our federal budget. They're there because of that. They've developed over many, many years, and there are strong lobby groups, and there are people who feel very strongly about them. So if you don't deal with it at one time, or mostly at one time, and try to get a comprehensive plan where really everyone's going to be affected, we think you fall prey to that death of a thousand knives. It is difficult work. And it's difficult work, as I tried to characterize by the questions I posed to all of you earlier. Everyone's going to feel some sense of hurt out of this, and that's probably about right if it's shared that way. If this gets lopsided one way or the other, there's not an opportunity to really find a political consensus around it.
Thank you, Sandy, for all your hard work on all our behalf. I found the economic statistics, to be appalling, even worse than I had thought. But what seems to concern me, as well as the socio-political, as well as the international relations, others hold our debt. What does that mean? Is that something I, as a citizen, should be concerned about? Should I be concerned purely about the economic issues that you outline, or are there potentially severe international relations and national security issues that I should be aware of?
Yeah, I don't think you even have to go abroad to think about the first risk. You know, today, if you look at 10-year Treasury rates in the U.S., slightly below 2, popping around 2 on any given day. If we go back to more trend levels of interest and pick your number, 4 to 6%, the interest payments do balloon. So we are in an artificial period of being comfortable with our debt load today. That debt load could double very easily. It could triple very easily with no more debt. And so we have the luxury right now, due to our monetary policy, of having relatively low interest payments due at the federal government. That's why we need to act now. I mean, even if you didn't add another dollar of debt, 10 years from now, I can virtually guarantee you the interest rate's not going to be 2%. And as that interest rate goes up, it's going to crowd out everything else in the budget. So I think that's issue one, is that I think we're artificially comfortable because of low rates. I think the second issue, in terms of how do we compare and what neighborhood we're in, clearly our neighborhood's a little bit better than the European neighborhood right now. It's not as attractive as some of the Asian situations today. And so I don't think there are a lot of better places from a security point of view in terms of a feeling that the country can stand behind its debt than the U.S. at this point. And so I think that's solid. I think the bigger risk is this interest rate issue could explode on us very quickly.
Mr. Cutler, you spoke very eloquently about the potential problems of an escalating national debt. I'd like to ask you about a local problem involving the Cleveland Plain Dealer. The Cleveland Plain Dealer, within the next 3 months, has announced that it's not going to be making a home delivery every day. It'll only be maybe 3 or 4 or 5 days a week, which sort of puts Cleveland on a second-class level. Eaton Corporation has had a wonderful record of helping all kinds of civic endeavors throughout the city of throughout Northern Ohio, actually, in the city of Cleveland. And you and your family have also had an excellent record. What do you think the possibility is of this late date of having a drive of some kind of leaders such as you and others to reach the Newhouse family and perhaps purchase the paper from the Newhouse family so we continue to have a first-class paper all the time?
Well, I would welcome any other beneficiaries of this large consortium that's needed. Obviously, I think clearly the paper, which has been a hallmark in our community for so many years, what's changing in the world today is how news is delivered, and Terry can speak to that much more eloquently than I can. I haven't seen a surge yet to meet your request in that regard, but I think those are the issues. That it's tough. It's why organizations have to have fiscal prudence. I think we see companies succeed and other companies not succeed, and I think it just plays back to this broader issue we were talking about in terms of the national level. Fiscal prudence matters, and if you don't have it, you can't keep governments going, you can't keep companies going, you can't keep communities going. And we've seen a lot of examples in our communities over the time where, whether it's charitable institutions, whether it's faith-based institutions, whether it's important social service agencies, that if you don't have this strong fiscal prudence, there comes a day when you can't continue the number of operations you had. And that's the real threat we see at a national level right now, too. We're all worried about these important programs that support very big parts of our population. And if we don't get this fiscal situation under hand, it isn't going to be a matter of either one of us or any one of us feeling strongly about one issue. All issues fall to the ground when you have that kind of crisis.
Sandy, I appreciate that we as citizens need to have our voices heard so that this issue is dealt with. But I must admit, when I think about our voices being heard before our legislators, and even if we send letters, thousands of letters, I'm a little cynical about that effectuating a bipartisan move toward the center. So does the Fix the Debt Coalition have other strategies in which to apply pressure so that this becomes more than just a conversation, but in fact action?
Yeah, it's a great question, Barbara. It is a situation where it's not simply letters, it's the forums, and I would tell you that in my estimation, there is a very substantial group of members of the House and the Senate that we've met with who very much gets this subject, and it very much gets the issue that they have to find the basis for constructive consensus. The political challenge, and the Senator could speak to this much more eloquently than I can, is that today it's not safe for them to compromise. And what I mean by safe, it's not safe for the support from within their own party and many of their strongest supporters. And so you need something to give them cover. And we think, and that's why we've come together as this group, that we can help provide that cover by helping to educate Americans as to how important this be done, to hope that the administration will also help provide some of that cover. And with that cover, people can compromise and not sacrifice their seats, if they will. That's the dynamic we're working so hard on, but it starts with education. And I can tell you that last year when we had the many thousands of letters delivered into Washington, it did make a difference. And when you sit in a member of the House or the Senate's office and you listen to the dialogue in terms of who they're hearing from on an issue, it does make a difference. So don't ever believe your voice doesn't count. Now, these men and women are serving because they believe it's important to serve in our country, and they will respond to you as the people who elect them if you will be articulate and well-educated on the subject and present them with why you feel that. That's why they're there. When they don't hear from you, they fall prey to the small extremes on both ends of the equation that are pulling them in different directions. And so fill their mailbox and let them know how you feel. Get on the telephone, fill up their emails. They will respond. I'm very confident of that. And we've been working on this for almost 4 years. And I can say that we're a lot closer now than we were 4 years ago in terms of the dialogue with many members of the Senate and the House.
Sandy, two different questions. First is the debt of state and local government, the particularly unfunded pension and retiree health care benefits. Don't we have to include an approach to deal with unfunded state and local government as well? The second question is about the third tool of deficit reduction, which is growth, where employers succeed the marketplace and generate more revenue and good-paying jobs. What's the role of that tool of deficit reduction?
If I could answer your second one first, growth is critical, but growth is not enough by itself. We won't grow ourselves out of this, but we do have to get on this creating the environment in which jobs get formed. One of the problems with this debate having gone on as long as it has, I mean, think how many, we've taken 3 shots at this baseball and we've struck out all 3 times so far. We're coming up to another debt ceiling, and I think many people have the question, will we whiff on this one too? Every time we miss, we create more uncertainty, because the discussion around the missing is fractious leading up to it. And then when it blows apart, I think people get the feeling that it's just never going to happen. So why do I want to participate? Higher uncertainty isn't good for anyone. Financial markets don't like it, companies don't invest, individual consumers don't buy, and all that leads to this non-virtuous cycle. So really important that we get that right. And so we really do think that finding the mechanisms to do this on a gradual basis, that's why really the principles are, again, commit to a plan, implement it over time, so it's not enough that it really upturns the apple cart of a fairly fragile recovery, is an important part of this. And that's where I think the scare techniques from both parties aren't very helpful, because we're not talking about trying to cut $5.3 trillion in 1 year. Obviously, that couldn't be done. This is done over a 10-year time period, and that's what allows us to have this beneficial impact by 2023. So really, really important part in that regard. And your first question was again?
state and local debt.
Oh, no, thank you. Yeah. What's interesting to me and to many people about this current situation is, you think about 2008, 2009, the first global liquidity crisis I witnessed in the time that I've been in business. And what's happened since then? Individuals have delevered, businesses have delevered, our financial institutions have delevered. Most of the states in the United States have balanced their budgets, save a couple. Now, there are some accounting issues where there's some big liabilities off balance sheet, if you will. That's true at the federal government as well. But remarkable progress at all those levels. What has not delevered is the federal government. Now, a piece of that, to be accurate, is due to the fact that as we try to provide support in the country in terms of this monetary policy, there were a lot of assets bought in. That's one of the reasons we've got the debt levels and all we're at, excuse me, the interest levels at this point. We've got to unwind that. That's going to take some time. But the expenditure levels have blossomed at a time when companies and communities and states have been cutting. And so that's the issue we say, and please look at the reality of what's happened in the last 4 to 5 years. The only place we haven't made progress is in the federal government spending. That ought to stand out like a big thumb to all of us that it's time to get after that at this point.
Sandy, you've talked about the very toxic politics that you're trying to deal with and that we as a nation have to overcome if we're going to succeed on this. And you're calling this the campaign to fix the debt. So I'm curious about whether you're using other kinds of campaign strategies and tactics to try to make progress beyond those you've mentioned. Are you doing things like planning television advertising or micro-targeting of individuals or grassroots organizing, all the kinds of things that campaigns have become very adept at doing in a short-term context to try to win an election? Are you applying those to this campaign?
Yeah, we're not applying money in individual campaigns. That's not the approach. Our approach is to mobilize Americans and to get major employers who have the opportunity to talk to their employees about these issues with the hope that those major forums with lots of employees will then engage in terms of expressing their individual opinions. That's really the approach. There are a lot of PACs around the world that do the other activities. We're really trying to emphasize this as a bipartisan or nonpartisan issue, and a lot of those other activities get to be kind of partisan activities. We do hold a lot of meetings with members of the House and the Senate, and that's been very helpful in both understanding the issues that they see, their own challenges they've got in that regard, and tried to build a consensus. I'm actually fairly optimistic about the progress that we see in meeting with a lot of very sincere and intelligent people that we find in our Senate and our House. And I would say that I think the reputation, unfortunately, that is out, that has been put out that people don't care, I don't think that's true. These are people who care deeply. They would not be serving otherwise. We've got to, as citizens, help them be able to make the dramatic actions they need to do to come together. And I would tell you the conversations are strong. They are, they're non-compromising in terms of what we hope to accomplish because it's taken too long. You wouldn't put up with this in almost any other forum in life. And it's time that Americans take that perspective on this issue. We can't wait to cut this debt. It's got to happen now.
Mr. Cutler, there's been a lot of talk recently about the need for tax reform. Reform to do in what manner? Have you considered other models in addition to the current income tax-based ones such as sales tax, flat tax, value-added tax? What do you and your organization think about tax reform?
Again, the campaign to fix the debt hasn't taken a specific position on individual elements or rates. What they have endorsed is what came out of the first Simpson-Bowles and then this just revised one, which are the principles that you're going to have to broaden the base. 52% of Americans today don't pay any federal income tax, first time in history. You probably can't make these numbers work unless you get back to a more normal issue. You've got to eliminate deductions, and they're called tax expenditures is what they're called in the law, otherwise known as loopholes that have been put in place over time. It's a very big number, and that will be painful because they cover everything from mortgage deduction to interest deduction to charitable contribution deductions to accelerated manufacturing credits. It's a long list in that, but big parts of that have got to be dealt with. There are individuals who have looked at several other models. Campaign for Debt hasn't taken a specific position on them. I'll mention those three in a minute. Going to a territorial tax system, the Campaign for Reducing the Debt has endorsed. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this, there are two theories of international taxation and corporate tax. One's called world taxation, one's called territorial taxation. World taxation taxes all profits any company has around the world at the U.S. rate, essentially, and it's how you bring cash back and forth in the country. Most of the country has gone to something called territorial taxes, and the U.S. Hasn't made this movement. The rest of the world, except 4 industrial nations, have all moved to it. If we want to be able to have companies in the United States that can export well and that can do business around the world, we got to move to a territorial tax system. Both England and Japan in the last 5 years have moved to territorial tax systems because they were losing competitiveness. And the change has been fairly substantial for both of them. Germany has now as well. And so we just got to get on that track. The other proposals that many people have talked about, but the campaign has not taken a position on, is the national sales tax, called a VAT tax. When any of you travel abroad, you buy goods, you pay a VAT tax. That's another way of raising money. That is a second type of tax that Europe has that the U.S. does not have. You will hear many people advocate what we have to do to close the debt here in the U.S. is have a VAT tax. To make that work, it's got to be somewhere between 6 and 10%. So every good you buy in the U.S., and you think of it as a consumption tax, would have another 6 to 10% on it. It's a fairly poisonous concept if you are an elected official, because you immediately are going to hear feedback from anyone who has voted for you, regardless whether you're independent, Republican, or Democrat. The other one is the concept of the much higher gas tax. That's one that Europe uses. When you're here, you find gas at about $3 per gallon. When you're in Europe, you find it about $9 per gallon. It's not the production cost that's different. It's the 300% gas tax. And that's used to pay for a lot of infrastructure and a lot of health care issues in Europe. Again, many people feel that's a pretty poisonous concept, that if you're going to tell people you're going to bump their gas from 3 to 9, it's a big ticket. But those are some of the approaches that other countries have taken in this regard. We've not espoused any one of those, just ought to know that those are alternatives different people talk about.
Today at the City Club, we have been listening to a Friday forum featuring Sandy Cutler, the chairman and CEO of Eaton Corporation and a member of the CEO Fiscal Leadership Council with the Campaign to Fix the Debt. Thank you, Mr. Cutler. Thank you, ladies.